Darkness. Nothing but darkness, and the faint sound of a drum beating somewhere deep in a forest you cannot see. Imagine a land where the morning air smells of red earth and rain, where iroko trees stand so tall they seem to hold the sky in place,
where children laugh in market squares and women weave color into cloth. A land of people who have been here since before memory. Now imagine that same land under the shadow of empire, where every harvest brings dread instead of celebration, where the sound of approaching horses means something has been taken again. He was just a farmer. No crown rested on his head, no throne carried his name. He worked the soil until his back ached and his hands bled.
But there are moments in history when the world does not choose its instrument from the palaces of kings. Sometimes it reaches down into the red dirt of a farm, and it finds a man who has been pushed far enough. This is the story of Lisabi Agbongbo Akala, a man history tried to forget, but could not. The farmer who destroyed an empire. Right now, scattered across the African continent and across every diaspora community in the world, there are millions of people who carry greatness in their blood and do not know it. Not because that greatness does not exist, but because no one told them. Not in the classrooms, not in the history books. The warriors, the revolutionaries, the farmers who became legends. So many of them erased, buried under layers of a history that was written to exclude them. This channel refuses that erasure. African Stories with Dre exists for one reason: to bring these stories back, to restore the heroes to their rightful place in human memory. Every video on this channel is an act of remembrance. If you are watching this right now, and something in you is stirring, hit subscribe. Not just for this video, but because you deserve to know where you come from. Because your children deserve to grow up knowing the names of people like Lisabi. Now, let us go back to the red clay forests of what would one day become Abeokuta. Back to the world that made Lisabi necessary. To understand Lisabi, you must first understand the world he was born into. You must smell the red Egba earth after a night of rain. You must feel the particular quality of light in that forest at dawn, amber and green and ancient. The Egba were farmers. They grew yam in thick mounds of turned earth. The harvest season was a celebration. The masquerades dancing at crossroads, the women singing as they carried headloads of produce. To the north and east, something enormous had been growing: the Oyo Empire. At its height, Oyo was one of the most powerful states in all of West Africa. The secret of Oyo's power was the horse. Every harvest season, they came. They did not ask, they took. Any farmer who dared question the assessment was an insult to imperial authority. So the Egba paid, even when paying meant their children would go hungry. People can forget what they used to be, if enough dignity is stripped away. But not all of them forgot. Some carried the memory, like an ember under ash, waiting for the breath that would bring it back to life. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a working man of the soil. But he was a working man who had never fully accepted what the empire required of him. The requirement to pretend that this was normal. He noticed the silence, that enforced, practiced, learned silence that had settled over Egba land like a fog that never lifted. And he felt something that most men around him had long since extinguished: anger. He noticed the silence,
That enforced, practiced, learned silence that had settled over Egbaland like a fog that never lifted. And he felt something that most men around him had long since extinguished. Anger. And Oba, a recognized traditional ruler and representative of his people's dignity, was forced to bow before Oyo representatives in front of his own community, made to perform submission so that every person watching would absorb the lesson. The Osai had begun to demand more than the official tribute. Personal items, forced labor. They had begun treating Egba elders with contempt, designed not just to collect resources, but to humiliate. There are moments when a man stops calculating the cost of rebellion and starts calculating the cost of silence. That night, alone by the dying light of a fire, Lisabi looked at his own hands, and something inside him became very quiet and very certain. No more. 2 words, the most dangerous words a man could say. Because Lisabi was not saying no more to himself. He was saying it as a plan. Lisabi began with whispers, not in the market, in the forest, the deep Egba forest that surrounded every village, and which the Egba knew better than any Oyo spy ever could. He asked a question. Is this the life your children deserve? What Lisabi built was not an army in any conventional sense. He used this existing cultural framework. He created what appeared to any outside observer to be another farmers' guild, a brotherhood of working men who met to coordinate planting seasons. What Lisabi built was a network, a web, each node connected to others but not fully visible to all. Each man knowing enough to do his part, but not so much that his capture could unravel the whole. The hardest enemy Lisabi fought was not Oyo. It was the fear that lived in his own people's hearts. He reminded his men of something that had been buried under years of submission, that the Egba had never consented to this. He created within the network a culture of mutual commitment, a covenant that said you are not alone. A man who dies standing is more alive than a man who spends his whole life on his knees. And then the network was ready. And then the plan was complete. And then Lisabi looked at the men who had trusted him with their lives, and he said, "It is time." What Lisabi had planned was not a battle. He was not foolish enough to believe that farmers with machetes and hunting bows could defeat the most fearsome cavalry in West Africa in open combat. What he had planned was a surgical strike, not on the Empire's army, but on the Empire's administrative presence in Egbaland. Lisabi's plan was this. On a single agreed night, every cell of the organization would activate simultaneously. Simultaneously. Not one town at a time, but all of them at once. The signal went out, and the Egba moved. In Egbain, in Ake, in Okeona, in Gabura. Men who had bowed their heads for years now stood straight. No one believed farmers could defeat warriors. But Lisabi had not built an army to fight warriors. He had built a tide, and tides do not negotiate. When dawn broke over the forest, that same amber and green dawn that had watched 1,000 mornings of submission, something was different in the air. For the first time in living memory, the Oyo Osi were gone. Every last one of them. And in the profound silence, they were free. Victory came, but victory, as Lisabi would soon discover, does not arrive alone. It always brings consequences, because the Oyo Empire had not been destroyed. It had been insulted. and empires respond to insult with a fury that is entirely different from their response to a military threat. The empire did not just send soldiers, it sent a message. Thousands of Oyo cavalry, the legendary ironclad riders of the north, began the march. This was not a tax collection. It was a liquidation of a people who had dared to say no. But the greatest threat to the Egba was not the horses. It was the whisper. Fear is a poison that works best from the inside. Some began to wonder if freedom was worth the fire that was now coming for their homes. Lisabi knew. He knew that in a fair fight, they would lose. He led his people deep into the forest, into the jagged protection of the rocks and the thickest vines, where horses could not run. But he also knew that someone had told the enemy where to look. He stood at the mouth of the forest, a farmer with a warrior's soul. He didn't ask for a crown. He asked for a moment. A moment to ensure that even if he fell, the idea of an independent Egba would live forever. History becomes a ghost story here. Some say he fell in the thick of the fight. Others say the earth itself opened up to hide its favorite son. But the result was the same. Lisabi was gone, and the empire found nothing but empty forest and a spirit they could no longer break. They were free, but the price was etched into the soil. The Egba stood on their own land, looking at the smoke of the battle, realizing that their hero had paid the ultimate price to turn a group of farmers into a nation. Lisabi did not just free a group of villages, he gave birth to a nation. From the chaos of the uprising and the retreat into the rocks, the Egba began to coalesce. They were no longer just farmers hiding in the forest. They were the architects of a new identity. They found their sanctuary in the shadow of the great rock, Olumo. It became their fortress, their watchtower, and eventually, the heart of Abeokuta. Under the rock, a city built on the memory of a man who refused to stay small. You can still hear him in the songs the mothers sing to their children, in the way an Egba man carries himself in a crowded room. They say, Lisabi lives, not as a ghost, but as a standard of dignity that can never be lowered again. History tried to bury him under the records of kings and the reports of empires, but the land has a better memory than the books. Lisabi Agbongbo Akala remains the patron saint of the common man, the proof that one person with enough conviction can break the back of a giant. His story belongs to the Egba, yes, but it also belongs to anyone, anywhere, who has ever felt the weight of an unfair system and wondered if they had the power to change it. Lisabi is the answer to that question. The empire is gone. The cavalry is dust. The Osi are forgotten names in a dead ledger. But the farmer is still here.